Hey everyone, I've been chugging along on those sprites at what pace I can manage. Hope y'all have been doing well. My guild's off break with the re-release of Siege of Orgrimmar, so I wanted to put out another devlog before I got busier again. A good amount more stuff is done so far, but today we're just going to be talking about one unit in particular, the Harvester. Dune 2000 originally had this iconic beetle harvester, the aesthetic of which is inspired by the David Lynch film, of course. I'm sure you remember it from past devlogs if you're unfamiliar with the game itself and are just following along. It was very big and round, but its wings only ever opened to dock at a refinery. It's supposed to be super massive hardware, so it relies on things like carryalls to fly them places. Spice is the most valuable substance in the known universe, in the lore of Dune. For gameplay purposes, the Harvester is one of the most important units on the field, since it's responsible for funding the player's war efforts. Doing up a new Harvester offers more opportunities to shake up how the economy works. It has to be handled respectfully though. There has to be substantial effort poured into the new look. So let's talk about what new art is on the table, and then get into other details. Psycho, our voxel artist, had this take on the Harvester. It might be a boxy shape, but don't underestimate it. There are more details to it than initially may meet the eyes. Too many to translate accurately to the sprite set. For instance, there are 4 gray lines partitioning the orange sections flanking the voxel, and there's a dip between the top and the side. These thin details are broken apart on many frames. To ensure consistency between frames, I sanded out 2 of the gray lines and polished up the other 2, and the dip. The unit keeps some of a crisscross on its sides as a result, but there's now a large solid section in the middle of that. Another interesting feature on this unit is its triple-layered optic. The cyan pixels on the front, overlooking those forks at the bottom. I did what I could to make more of the optic visible from more angles, and ensure that the fork is consistently spiky. The old Beetle Harvester lacked much faction color, making it difficult to distinguish whose side it belonged to in Dune 2000. This is another thing the new voxel improves. Rather than one small dot of faction color on top, it has 4 splashes of it, one above each of the treads. As iconic as the original Beetle Harvester was, this new one is distinct in its own ways. It grew on me while I was familiarizing myself with its details, and I think it shows promise to become a well-beloved design by other players. No small part of endearment is where it gets put to use and how, however. And to understand that, we have to understand resource gathering in D2K. On Arrakis, there are these blobs of spice melange out on the sand. Harvesters can go gobble that up and return it to a refinery, generating 700 Solari per load. There are a couple of hazards on the sand though. For one, spice blooms cause the harvestable resources on the map to regenerate, but cause damage to units in the vicinity. That's not a problem for heavily armored harvesters, but what is a problem is the sandworms, which gobble up vehicles within their reach on the sand. This is pretty standard, feels like anything out of Command & Conquer. Resources being the key to everything though, they are the determining factor in macro mission design and gameplay flow. Part of considering how to improve this system is considering what it incentivizes in the first place. The average RTS campaign enjoyer is a turtler, and for good reason. The home front advantage is incredibly potent. Dune 2000 is no exception. Not only do you have these regenerating resources via the spice blooms, but turrets in the original Dune 2000 were ridiculously imbalanced. To give you an idea of how, here are the stats of the Atreides combat tank, which is the well-balanced one in firing rate and hit points. And here are the stats of the gun turret, which has comparable weaponry.
Bruh.
It's cheaper, tougher, and that weapon on the gun turret has slightly higher damage and superior range to the combat tank. The gun turret also attacks more often. And as if that weren't enough, buildings can be repaired on demand, as opposed to vehicles which have to go park themselves on the repair pad. Now, it would be unfun to completely stop a player from turtling up. We want to discourage, not prevent, for the sake of player freedom. But why do we want to discourage turtling? Let's take another step back and remember the gameplay loop and what it is we're trying to smooth out. Build base, harvest resources, defeat enemy. Those are the 3 acts of any macro mission. the player stakes his claim, erecting structures where he sees fit. He has to bank up resources to afford expansion, and the forces to protect his base. When ready, he must venture out to enemy territory and destroy them utterly. The unfortunate reality of how this gameplay loop usually pans out is, the toughest part of the mission tends to be the beginning, when the player is getting situated and doesn't yet have a defense organized. If you're turtling, then after that initial hurdle, you just get to watch enemy units bash their heads against your defenses, and self-destruct for a while, until you have a big army amassed safely behind those defenses and can move out eventually and obliterate the enemy. In other words, turtling too often allows the player to get comfortable, which is contrary to engaging him. If we want to challenge the player, we are better off incentivizing the player to make moves on the battlefield, to take risks, as opposed to saturating the battlefield with more enemy units for the player to fight. That way, he's actively making decisions, actively strategizing, and is less likely to be scared back into his shell. I'll save how I like to set up the enemy so a mission is unlikely to overstay its welcome for some other devlog. The third stage, defeating the enemy on their home turf, is its own beast. For now, let's stay focused on the economy. Something you may have picked up from the 8-Bit Armies episodes I've done so far, if you've been following that series, is that I consider it very important to chain structures off to the next resource node, to a point. There are some aspects to the 8-Bit RTS games that are unapplicable or unwise to apply to Dune 2000. Structures in Dune 2000 can only be built on islands, for one. You can't just chain them around. And as much as I enjoy the Gold Star mission timer as a concept for an arcadey style game where the macro missions play out on symmetrical maps and have these gamey challenges in the form of the silver objectives, in 8-Bit, that sort of thing is fine in my opinion. But if we were to port that over to Dune 2000 for the average macro mission, it would feel like an artificial way to rush the player. A natural way to encourage the player to venture out early, to take risks and hopefully be rewarded, is in resource balancing. The name of the game is incentive. That's something appearing quite often in the 8-Bit RTS series, since each resource node is limited and can be depleted. It's probably the most important thing to take note of for how it affects the flow of the game. Some other RTS do this too, like StarCraft. Not quite as often as 8-Bit during the campaign missions though, to my recollection. 8-Bit really leans into it. Its resource nodes are scarce. Now, just because the spice can be replenished by blooms on Arrakis doesn't mean we get constant revenue from one place. The spice can be drawn in such a way that, in order to keep up with production, the player still needs to expand to fresh fields. As I mentioned earlier though, the way Dune 2000 works kind of contradicts what we want to incentivize from the player. We can only build on islands. The vanilla game is terribly limiting, often starting the player with his MCV already deployed into a construction yard. It cannot be repacked. So, that island you start on is where you're playing the whole mission from, at least until you get your own MCV. We've got some methods to improve player freedom at the very start nowadays, like this custom start location system, using a graphic from StarCraft 1's map editor which I ported over. That doesn't mean much if the game doesn't evolve from there, however. If you've played Command & Conquer 3 or Red Alert 3, you know your con yard can be repacked into an MCV at almost any time, even during the campaign mission. This enabled some interesting mission objectives during the campaign, like where you need to steal an enemy con yard and bring their MCV back to your base. In multiplayer, the player can sacrifice that build queue temporarily to move the construction yard's build radius elsewhere on the map. This is something I wanted to port to Dune 2000 because the idea of making sacrifices to gain something else is a strategic element I want to encourage. So we did. Through some new events, con yards can now be repacked into MCVs. Bam, lots more player freedom. Some other things have to change too, of course. With repackable con yards, the player could leave concrete all over the place. Thus, this was a great excuse to nix concrete foundation build radius. That game mechanic makes it all too easy to exploit the enemy AI, which doesn't know to destroy concrete belonging to the player. The player could just keep building barracks in their base, train an engineer, capture something, sell or lose the barracks, and repeat. Which is incredibly lame and anti-fun. We want the clashing of giant armies. Something I did to discourage that exploit in my past Summer Solstice campaign was simply making engineers more expensive and take longer to train. It's not ideal though. This prevents the exploit entirely. And, more importantly, it means the player has to hold the ground he takes outside of his base. If you lose all your regular buildings on some other island, you can't rebuild it until you bring your MCV back over there again. On its own, this reduces the value of turrets because they protect your existing border. Turrets can remain potent, efficient defenses, can remain fun for our turtley friends, yet the player cannot rely on them so much anymore. The player has to rely more on units to push the front and claim more territory. With that, we've incentivized the player to expand his borders and fight over them, creating a whole heap of decision-making throughout the process, and keeping the battle moving around the map in a natural way, even before the player is ready to go on the attack and bust the enemy base. But we can take it further. The world of Arkanon does not have spice blooms. The salts, much like the minerals in StarCraft, can be depleted. While this requires the player to eventually seek resources elsewhere, helping to hasten the pace of a mission, it comes with a risk if things go into the late game, if the map runs out of money. There are two ways I'm looking to address this. First, we can take a page from Blizzard's book. You may recall from their RTS games, like Warcraft 3, how enemy workers don't withdraw much from gold mines. The reason for this is so the player can build his own base in conquered enemy territory, and isn't severely punished for taking his time. Thus, I devised a system that replenishes salt tiles under enemy harvesters beneath Shroud. If the player can't see them, enemy harvesters will never deplete their salt fields. Once the player does scout them out, it becomes important to harass them and drive them out of the fields for more reasons than merely choking the AI's economy. As for the second thing, I'm looking to Command and Conquer generals for inspiration. The piles of supplies in that game that serve as the harvestable resources are also depletable. Its solution for late-game economy issues was player-built revenue-generating entities, the US Supply Pad, GLA Black Market, and Chinese Hacker. A key distinction, however, is that these things can be placed anywhere you'd like. You can turtle up and build 10 supply pads behind your defense line, meaning you never have to worry about going anywhere outside your base until you're ready. This sort of setup would be contrary to my vision. Therefore, my sister drew some special salts clusters where mining rigs can be built. Mining rigs are a new structure in Dune 2000, initially drawn up by the Dragon. Kip drew a damaged version, I made further adjustments, particularly to the animation, and As Stalker did us up the sidebar icon. Psycho also did his own version of the mining rig, maybe I'll put that one to use instead, but for now this is what I'm working with. Anyway, by making these mining rigs buildable in specific locations only, that allows me to limit how much infinite income the player has access to in a given area of the map. More rig build spots closer to the enemy is more incentive to set up an aggressive forward position. Maybe some rig spots tucked away in a corner make the player think, oh, I'm glad I went exploring and scouted this out. You see, all these pieces put together make for a promising restructuring of the gameplay loop. All of it surrounding the harvester we've been working on. Part of balancing the mining rigs fairly is making sure their rates are comparable with harvesters. At the default movement speed of 16, a harvester mining from a field directly adjacent to a refinery will take about 210 seconds to return 3 loads, or 2100 credits. That's in in-game time. We can consider that to be maximum efficiency harvesting. Harvesters' efficiency will decrease over time as they deplete fields closer to the base. We want the mining rig to be substantial. The player may have to move his MCV to get to a viable spot to build some. 210 is exactly a tenth of 2100, which makes it pretty easy to math out where a mining rig's rate of income generation should be. And it should be based off harvesters around their best to be sure they're worthwhile. If refineries cost 2100 credits to build, we could make mining rigs 700 credits and have them generate 200 credits over every 60 seconds. That means it will take roughly the same amount of time for a mining rig to pay itself off as it takes for the free harvester you get with a well-placed refinery to recoup the cost of the refinery. So, 3 mining rigs is worth a single high-efficiency harvest. They're not enough to sustain an army on, and if the player gets to the point that they are, well, the mission's over anyway. But they can provide enough income to fuel the player's expansion efforts, besides serving to incentivize expansion in the first place. I mean, I'm thinking about improving the harvester's speed slightly, like by 12.5%, but these numbers should still be okay. It's mostly to adjust for more frequent long-distance harvesting, diminish the urgency to amass many harvesters, and also for fun. Harvesters with zoomies are fun. I mean, build speed recalculations are also a consideration, like, we can surpass the 200% build speed cap for vanilla D2K now, so there will be more of a drain on player resources as units are built faster, even with only one factory. But I digress. Balancing the economy is a bit tricky with how the folks who have mathed out the optimal build orders have done so for maps that are overloaded with resources. Campaign missions can't reasonably be designed to always facilitate max production. Normally, the multiplayer guys like to start with 4 refineries and 12 harvesters, and will spam more refineries after their production speed is capped. I've got a great test map already with Arc Debut, it's something I suppose I should play through sometime, but it is pretty well saturated with salts. I compared with a vanilla Dune 2000 mission for my next test map. Have a look at this full map image here. This will be the test map I try to tune island warfare on, and I drew it up to test how well I could use a modest amount of space for a high-tech level mission. Its dimensions are 110 by 80 tiles, with the maximum being 128 by 128. It's designed for 3 player start locations and 3 enemy base locations, with the largest in the top right. The Atreides' 8th mission in the original campaign is 96 by 96, 9,216 tiles as opposed to 8,800, and it also has 3-ish enemy bases on it. So it's a decently close comparison, only slightly larger. It has 410 thick spice tiles and 1,108 thin spice tiles, for a total of 385,600 credits in harvestable resources, and 23 spice blooms to generate more spice later. The map I drew up has 472,000 credits in harvestable resources, as well as 20 mining rig build locations. In theory, the mining rigs can be considered equivalent to spice blooms, and the way this is set up will discourage the spamming of refineries and harvesters, while still providing enough for a campaign mission to play out, of course. Besides expanding for resources, the player will need to move around to get more build space for his factory structures and reactors as well. I already asked Psycho to do up a hover body for the MCV, so the player can send it across the water as needed. That makes a hypothetical start location like the top left way more fair than it might appear, since the player can get easier access to the left middle island and its resources than the bottom left start location. Strictly by distance, it's closer. The act of repacking the construction yard into an MCV temporarily sacrifices the building queue, something else I'm accounting for in my calculations. It means the player requires less income at times, and can dedicate more funds towards units to defend himself with or attack the enemy with, to clear out their satellite bases and claim the resources for himself. This is kind of a side note, but I was thinking for a playable mission on this map that the main enemy bases would be in these locations in the top rightish areas, and the player start location choices would be in the top left, bottom left, and bottom right. I purposefully designed these areas to drastically change how the mission can be expected to play out. The top left is fairly small, but has that nearby expansion location I mentioned earlier. If we put the main enemy base in the top right, I just need to make sure it's designed so the enemy harvesters don't wander into the field closest to the player. That'll give the player maximum room to harvest from there. And because the player has a direct land connection with the largest enemy base, all units can come into play from the start for fighting them. Or, the northwest enemy position can be besieged from a more vulnerable angle with some hover tech. The bottom right also shares a direct land connection with an enemy base, but the player has more breathing room, including a natural expansion location at the bottom middle. Having the smallest starting island, there are 3 mining rig build spots in close proximity. As for the bottom left, that's where I would want the player's viewport to start on, so it could be considered the encouraged start location. It's totally isolated from all enemy islands, meaning the player is safest from enemy attacks. He'll need to expand elsewhere to use infantry units against the enemy, but it has a very comfortable amount of building space and resources. To gauge the accuracy of my calculations, they will need to be put to the test in a real example like this. The diversity of potential start locations is intended to rigorously challenge them, so we'll have to see how it pans out when I design a mission on this map. Some things are still up in the air, like I need to create the custom airlift behavior that'll get non-hovertech vehicles from island to island. At least 1 naval unit still needs to be voxeled to put to the test on this map. I need to govern how many landlocked units, like infantry, will be built by the AI so they don't oversaturate their bases with defense forces. There are lots of things to account for. I guess that's stuff for later though. All of this surrounds the harvester we finished up today. The harvester is the mechanism through which we interact with the rest of the game in this fashion. So let's have a look at the final result. I had to adjust the docking animation too. Lots of it is conveniently copy-pasted from frame 12, but the rear of the vehicle opens up and a thingy sticks into the other thingy on the refinery. The angle was pretty awkward at first, but thanks to Psycho's counsel, we got that adjusted properly too. These boxy boys took more effort than I thought they would, but I did my best to pay attention to all their little details and clean them up to be nice and shiny. It's my hope they prove a satisfying alternative to the original iconic beetle harvester. I want the player to both admire his own harvesters, shuffling the salts around in the field, and get a murderous gleam in his eyes when he spots an enemy harvester. Like spotting a chest full of loot. You just want to go crack that box open. Oh, one more thing as a side note, I guess. Speaking of shuffling salts around, the original spice tiles were all duplicates of the fully surrounded thin spice tile. Westwood and Intelligent Games airbrushed around that tile to get the variations we see in the in-game spice fields. My sister is an absolute mad lass and drew each thin salts tile individually. I documented her incredible efforts rather thoroughly in the thread linked in the description, but with regards to the salts tiles in particular, this causes them to shift around as they're broken up and harvested by our big boxy boys. I don't intend them to regenerate like the spice on Arrakis, so this should make them more aesthetically varied and interesting while they're present on the map. Nice to look at. Well, I guess that's all for now. I've got to keep at the sprite work, there's a lot more to do, but I hope to do some more mapping sometime soon as more unit assets become available. I'm waiting on the Energy Swordsman to get started on the first Imperial Sardaukar mission in the series, since they'll feature as a noteworthy enemy unit. Before that, I'll probably do another couple of devlogs at least, to cover some other sprite work that got handled. For now though, I'll bid you adieu. Thanks for watching, have a nice day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.